You've heard of the making of an American quilt, but today on Austin Faith Dialogue, we're going to be looking at the making of a religious quilt. Please join us.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, welcoming you to this edition of the show. It's been a quilting bee. That's the association that so many folks make with quilting in the religious community. But long before there were quilting bees, and in so many varied ways today, quilting is an expression of faith. And we're pleased to have someone who can not only interpret this verbally, but to show us the work of quilters in the Austin area and from other places. This is Marcia Kalacki, who is a quilter and who also has been active with the Austin Area Quilting Guild and is a Catholic layperson.
Yes.
In all of those capacities, we welcome you, Marcia.
Thank you.
And I think the first question that comes to mind is how long has quilting been an expression of people's faith?
Quilting goes back much farther than anyone ever realized until recently. There has been a wonderful book written called Patchwork Pilgrimage by Jill Liddell with historical essays by her husband Andrew Liddell. And they have wonderful examples of quilted vestments, chasubles, bishop's copes, and mitres, all from the 14th century in England, Spain, and Italy.
Okay. Now, we don't have anything here today that goes back that far, though.
Not quite. Not quite. But we do have some wonderful examples, even one from the middle of the last century.
Oh, really?
That is an American quilt, and I'm very proud that it is part of my quilt collection.
Okay.
Quilting goes back in the American history right from the very beginning when the Pilgrims arrived. Now, I don't have anything quite that old because nothing exists particularly from that time period, but women who were pioneers and women who were settling new communities in America turned to the Bible for inspiration for their quilt blocks. And that's where I'd like to start today. We have a wonderful example of how women went to the Bible to name their newly created quilt blocks.
Okay.
And the farthest one, the brilliant black and brilliant color quilt, is an example of a Jacob's ladder. And many of you will remember the children's hymn, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. And this I have borrowed courtesy of my dear friend Erica Rogala. The next quilt is...
Well, just for a moment, though, we were looking, getting a little closer up there. If we can look at that again, give us a little bit of what we're looking at.
Well, actually, the ladder is on the diagonal. And if
Okay.
you were to look from the lower corner of the quilt up to the upper and take the brilliant colors and visualize that they are rungs in a ladder.
Ah.
And as the blocks were pieced together, the ladder climbed higher and higher.
That is really a beautiful piece in terms of both its color and its pattern.
Well, it's one example of how a modern quilter can interpret an old pattern and with modern fabrics and create an entirely new and very visually exciting quilt.
I mean, Jacob's ladder is one from a long time back.
Yes, absolutely. We know of Jacob's ladder turns up early in the 1800s in Lady Godey's quilt book and the quilt patterns that we have from the Kansas City Star. So.
And the biblical reference there is one that you find other biblical themes that, some other examples of that.
We see many biblical themes. Joseph's coat, Jacob's ladder. The next quilt that you see is Crown of Thorns. And this quilt is from 1857. It was made in Indiana. I recently found this quilt in Montgomery, Alabama, which means that quilts do travel. And if you look very carefully at the pattern, you can see, of course, the four corners, which look very prickly, and they are the crown of thorns. Now, as we have talked about in times before, you and I, quilt blocks very often have more than one name. And this quilt block actually has three names that I can think of right off the bat.
What are the others?
The other is Yankee Pride, and I would guess that name came about as a result of the Civil War. And the third name is Hands All Around.
Oh.
So you have 3 very different names for the same quilt block, and this is very, very common in the world of quilting.
I see. You're talking about the women who are doing quilting. I visualize women on the frontier.
Not all quilts were made on the frontier. Remember, there were lots of women left in the cities behind. And I would guess, judging from the large amount of madder red and turkey red that you see in this quilt, that this was not a quilt that was created from scraps.
Ah.
Okay? A true scrap quilt would not have this much of any one color in it.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess this was made in a city somewhere where calico goods, or they're called gray goods, were readily available to women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You know, the Live Oak Theater, a season or 2 back, had a play called Quilts.
The Quilters.
Or The Quilters.
The Quilters is probably the most famous of all the quilt-related plays. It enjoys a wide popularity throughout the United States and Europe. I had the opportunity to see it performed in the Wildflower Theater in Johnson City under much more rustic conditions than we had here. I saw it here as well. And one of the things that they talk about in the Quilters is not only the friendship, the companionship, the sisterhood, but how the Ladies' Aid Society came with quilts, okay, during a disaster. In this case, I believe it was a wildfire, a prairie fire.
Right.
And the first thing they did was arrive the Ladies' Aid Society with a pile of quilts. Why? You had to keep your family covered. Okay, as beautiful as these are, they also serve a functional purpose, and that is for shelter.
But I also remember in that play that these women were needing each other's company. They were needing to have this as a social expression of their faith.
Absolutely. It was a way for women not only to express their friendship and the social expression of their faith, but in many cases it was the only way they were allowed to express anything politically.
Oh, really?
Yes. Witness the quilt block 5440 or Fight.
Oh, there's a quilt.
Okay, there's a quilt block called
entitled that?
5440 or Fight. It has to do with when we were settling the boundaries of the Northwest Territories in Washington State.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes.
Wow.
Women very often created magnificent and unusual quilts. And in that same vein, they created magnificent and unusual quilts about their faith. And those are very rare quilts now. Many of them are held in private collections and very large quilt collections, such as the Artist and Robert James collection in the University of Nebraska.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, and I think even the AIDS quilt is a political statement as well as a compassionate statement.
It's an extremely compassionate statement. It's an extremely moving experience to see the AIDS quilt. It's massive. It covers acres and acres and acres and acres, and it brings home, when you read them, you're reduced to tears in many cases when you read not only the expression of sorrow, but the expression of extreme hope and belief in the resurrection.
Okay.
It's really wonderful.
All right.
It's quite a moving experience.
That's how it speaks to your faith.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Good.
Hope in the resurrection.
We do have a quilt from Hope Presbyterian Church, but I don't think that's next, is it?
No, it's not.
What's next over here? This is a quilt that represents in the community here in Austin, right?
Yes, this wonderful quilt that you see that says Stephen Ministry is from Northwest Hills United Methodist Church. And it was the smallest of all of the liturgical banners that I could bring this evening. I wish that I could have brought absolutely every banner that I saw at that church. They have a wonderful designer named Carolyn Patterson, and then with the help of Catherine Keneal and the quilters at Northwest Hills United Methodist Church, they create banners for every aspect of their religious life in the church. Weddings, holidays, Easter, Lent, and one of the wonderful ones I found was the Stephen Ministry. And when I said, what is the Stephen Ministry, they told me. The Stephen Ministry is a lay ministry outreach for this church. And what they do is they are specially trained by Stephen leaders, and they are able to provide that one-on-one compassionate outreach to members of the congregation that may need a little more time. They're going through a bereavement, a loss, an unsettling situation.
Right. It's a kind of lay counseling support.
Absolutely. Lay counseling and support, and this banner very aptly reminds the parishioners and the congregation when they are at church that this is available to them.
Yeah. How does it remind them of that?
Well, it says Stephen Ministry, and then it says above, bear the burdens of others.
Okay, but the symbolism.
The symbolism is of course, the lamb. Mm-hmm. And the Stephen Ministry has the banner. And it is the Lamb of God, and we all must bear each other up in light and joy for the sake of the Lamb. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I think that you're talking about how they make banners for a variety of seasons and occasions.
Wonderful.
I know some churches that, and it's not just women who do this.
Oh, absolutely not. There are a number of male quilters, and the ranks of male quilters are growing, and we're so happy to see it. Uh-huh. There are a number of very fine male quilters, and we have a few in the Austin community. And one or two of them attend the Austin Area Quilt Guild. I'm very happy to say that.
Yeah. Tell us just a little bit about that Quilt Guild. I've heard of it. I've heard you speak of it, but what goes on?
The Austin Area Quilt Guild is a wonderful guild in the United States. It's one of the medium to large guilds. We have about 550 members. We have monthly meetings where we have nationally known and locally known speakers on a variety of quilting topics. We sponsor workshops and lectures. We take outings to places like the Houston International Quilt Festival, the Dallas Quilt Festival, and then we have, in the context of the larger guild, we have bees. We have 38 quilting bees.
38?
38 quilting
in Austin?
bees. Oh, that's just the guild. There are other bees that are not connected with the Austin Area Quilt Guild. There are probably in excess of 150 bees that are really connected with in the Austin area.
Right.
Women and men are still getting together, but still creating beautiful expressions of their faith and other expressions in their bees. And the same essential ingredients happen in those bees. And that's faith, and that's companionship and friendship, and people reaching out to each other while they're doing something they love.
You know, once you told me, probably a pun for whatever reason has stayed with me all this time, about the companionship, the social dimension of quilting. You said something about you're meant to have not meant to have an out-of-buddy experience. Was that?
Oh yes, with quilting you never have it's always you're never out of a buddy, so it's an out-of-buddy experience.
Oh my.
Okay, well. He loved it.
Well, it's a way of bringing home the fact that this is meant to be done together, and in that movie, The Making of an American Quilt, that was a big theme, is that this was a companionship.
It was a companionship. It was a way for these women who were experiencing life's trials and tribulations to sit together and to talk together and to share their joys and their sorrows, because remember, they were making the quilt for the marriage of the granddaughter of one of the women.
Well, I think we're getting close to needing to take a break here, but I think that folks who want to should be looking in to see more of what you've brought to us and your insights. And so we will pause here and come back with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today we are talking with Marcia Kalaki, who is an area quilter, a Catholic layperson, and who has been in the first half giving us some beginning understanding of how quilts connect to the religious community, Marcia.
That's right.
And one that's behind us here that we didn't have a chance to comment on in the first half was this one that says Angel on it. Tell us about that.
Well, this is the Angel of Hope quilt from Hope Presbyterian Church. I was very excited when Rita Lloyd, who is a member of the Guild, came to me and said, I have a quilt I think might work. And I knew nothing about the Angel of Hope quilt until Rita actually put it in my arms yesterday. And I'm excited to tell you that the ladies of Hope Presbyterian Church make an angel quilt every year, and they raffle it, and along with their craft fair, which is called Hope for the Holidays, all of the proceeds go to fund the Austin Children's Shelter, which is an outreach ministry of Hope Presbyterian. This is a place where abused children who are being taken out of their home by court order can be safe. And they have food, clothing, shelter, doctor's checkups, dental visits, transportation arranged to their schools so that they can maintain their friendships, and as much recreational activity and continuation of their lives in a safe and loving environment.
And the quilts then are a means of raising funds for
Absolutely. These quilts are raffled off. They go for high dollars.
Okay.
And I'm very glad to say that. And the second angel quilt is nearing completion, and I believe will be raffled very shortly.
Now, speaking of friendship, I think to my right there's one called the Friendship Quilt, and that has to do with another denomination, doesn't it?
That's right. This is the 25th anniversary quilt of Friendship International, right here in Austin. And I have to tell you that it would be my one desire to show you every single block on this quilt. These blocks were made for the 25th anniversary of Friendship International by women of all over the world. And when I looked at this quilt, I found Slovakia, Japan, Korea, Brazil, Central America. It was amazing. Ireland, and ladies' blocks right from here in Austin, all combined together to create this wonderful quilt. The blocks did stay in block stage until just this past summer, when my good friend Shirley Smith, who teaches quilting at Friendship International, was given the lovely task of setting these together and creating a quilt top. And if you look at this quilt, you will notice it's covered with safety pins. And that is because it is still in the process of being quilted. And it is now the 30th anniversary. And when this quilt is finished, it will hang on display at Hyde Park Baptist Church.
Okay, now tell us about Friendship International. What is that?
Friendship International. I've had about 5 years' experience now with the wonderful ladies and men of Friendship International. This is an outreach program of the Baptist Church. And what it does is it creates a wonderful, welcoming environment for people of other parts of the United States and other countries in the world who maybe don't speak English as a first language, who just would feel awkward trying to live in a community. This creates a wonderful network of faith and support for those men and women who need a place to come and have friendship.
Okay, these are like people who have immigrated to this country.
Yes, they're either with spouses, they have immigrated here on their own, and they just don't know their way around Austin. And sometimes, you know, it can be awkward when you don't speak the language.
Okay, so when that happens, they're brought into a quilting society where they can contribute like patterns to this?
And they learn to quilt, and they learn to do other types of crafts. They learn to cook. They have English classes. They have Spanish classes. There's a lot of other things besides quilting, but I emphasize the quilting because I do know the quilters that are involved in it. And I do know that very many people benefit from the quilting classes at Friendship International.
Well, that's good to know about. And I think it's a real ministry of compassion for folks that would be disoriented otherwise.
Well, there are currently 20 Baptist churches in the Austin metropolitan area who are participating in Friendship International. So it is very widely and readily available here in Austin.
Now, there's another quilt beside that illustrates, as we talked about, how does a given quilt express a given faith? And tell us about that one. It's a much simpler kind of design. And
as many ornate quilts as we've seen today, this one really touches my heart. This is very simple shapes. They're only suggestive of what's really on the quilt. And that is, this is a nativity scene. This wonderful quilt was loaned to us by Karen Zalewski. Thank you, Karen. And she is also a member of the Austin Quilt Guild. And she hangs this every Christmas time in her home. And although you can't see it, there is a beautiful gold star at the top. And all it does is you just have to pass by it, and you just feel the majesty and serenity of this beautiful event in our Christian calendar.
What religious tradition or Christian tradition is she?
This would be from the Christian tradition. Yes, this is the Nativity. I have no idea
what church it may be.
or
okay.
It is, I know it's a privately held quilt in her collection.
But it's an interesting contrast to the traditional design. I mean, this is an abstract
This
design.
is very modern in its feel. It's very abstract, and it doesn't take very many lines, and it doesn't take very many shapes to really tell you the whole story.
Mary,
Mary perhaps kneeling, Joseph.
Maybe.
Mary kneeling, I would guess, because she's in blue, and that is the traditional color of Our Lady.
Sure.
Joseph standing, taller, stronger, the male figure, and of course the glorious golden joy of the halo of the baby
that's
Jesus.
Wonderful.
Yes, it's a lovely quilt.
Now, I know that you have another one from the Catholic tradition to show us here, which I think you're going to be holding for us.
Yes. Oh, I am so pleased to be able to have this quilt today. And many of our friends from the Hispanic community will recognize it immediately as an Our Lady of Guadalupe quilt. Okay? Our Lady of Guadalupe, of course, is very loved and revered, especially in Mexico. She is the patroness of the Mexican Catholic Church. And this quilt was created by Beth Kennedy. She is a quilt artist. She is nationally and internationally known. Several of her quilts are currently traveling the world. She creates magnificent quilts, and her large Our Lady of Guadalupe quilt, which is known as Shrine 1, is currently traveling a 2-year tour and is in Hawaii at the moment. And Beth thought that she might be so lonely without her Our Lady of Guadalupe quilt that she created a smaller quilt to hang in her home until the larger one returns to her.
Now, the thing that strikes me is that what you've got on the surface here are various materials.
Well, this is not a traditional quilt. This is an art quilt. And an art quilt will use a variety of materials which are very unlike a traditional quilt.
I mean, look at here. These
Yes.
are hanging.
Milagros, charms. You have a smaller version of Our Lady of Guadalupe. You have, I believe, a star. I'm looking at your hand. These would be milagros, or good luck charms. Okay, a heart.
Yeah.
And then you see the beautifully ornate border. You see birds.
Right.
You see flowers. Of course, you know, Our Lady, when she gave her vision in the cloak of the peasant, he was asked to bring roses to the bishop. And then when he unfolded his cloak, which was supposed to be full of roses, of course, there was the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe.
I see.
And this is a very colorful quilt. It's a very ornate quilt. It's very outstanding in its use of color and technique. Beth is truly one of our most talented quilt artists in the United States today, and we're very fortunate to have her here in Austin.
All right.
You see many, many things: butterflies, flowers, birds, all symbols of light and hope and love, and these are things that Our Lady brings not only to us, but to all the people of the Hispanic culture.
All right. You know, as you return that, I have a couple of questions that come to mind. And one was triggered by, I believe it was this quilt from Hope Presbyterian that was being used in behalf of children in need. And once you told me about, it was a story, it was a very moving story about a quilt that was made for a child that was, I believe, in a hospital.
In San Diego, a prayer quilt. I had hoped to have the opportunity to tell you again about the making of prayer quilts. This has become a very powerful ministry of the church, of every church I have ever seen it used in. It's a very powerful ministry. What happens is a request comes for a prayer quilt to be made immediately for a person or child for one reason or another. This one happens to have been in San Diego, California, for a critically ill child. And they wanted the quilt. And so the ladies of the church made a quilt top. They backed it and batted it, which means they put the center filling and the backing on it. They set up the frame in the hall, the church hall, and as a matter of fact, at one point they had it set up in the front hallway of the church. And anyone who wanted to could come and tie a tie. Quilts aren't always quilted. Sometimes they're tied. They could tie a tie and say a prayer for that child.
I see.
The quilt was made in one day. It was bound and rushed to the hospital where it was placed over the child. And the doctors actually gave orders for the quilt not to be taken from the child at any given time. And that child is happy and healthy and well today.
Ah.
It's an amazing story.
Yeah.
And time after time, we see the miraculous power of prayer that goes into the making of a quilt like this. And I do believe prayers are powerful. And I believe that the prayers really work.
So the prayer quilt is an expression of people care about a given individual.
Absolutely.
They don't just say the words.
They are tying the tie. And I think there's the symbolism of tying the prayer into the quilt.
I see.
And I always envision in my mind these quilts must be heavy because they're so loaded with powerful prayers. You know. And I have encouraged many churches here in Austin to begin working with the prayer quilt aspect.
Now we've talked about mostly Christian. I guess virtually all of these are Christian, but I remember you've also said that if you go on the internet and you put up requests for information about people doing quilting in a religious context, you'll hear from Jewish folks and people of other faith traditions.
Well, the first time I asked for information, I had 64 responses in 13 hours, which was just utterly stunning. I heard from Native Americans. I heard from the English about the Amish. Now, when I say that, you know the Amish do not use modern equipment.
Right.
But the English or American non-Amish members of the community were on immediately telling me about the wonderful Amish quilts. I heard from the Jewish quilting group. They make beautiful, and I was very, very sorry I could not bring one today, Torah covers and hangings for the temple. Right. Magnificent ones that have been recounted many times in books.
I notice now we do have the number of the Austin Area Quilt Guild there. If people can call if they're interested in what you said and want to find out more.
Yes, all they have to do is leave a voicemail message and just, you know, address it to me, Marcia K. Lackey, and ask your question, and the Guild will make sure that I get your voicemail. Okay.
And I think that, you know, not only as a quilter, but as a person of faith, you've given a dimension to this that if people look at it, they're going to appreciate. And I also think that as we've looked at these various quilts, if they want to call you directly and talk to you about this, they can reach you through this Quilt Guild.
Absolutely. They can reach me, just leave a voicemail, and they can reach me right through the Guild.
All right. Okay. Well, we'd like to thank you folks for looking in today, and we hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed doing it. And we look forward to seeing you on our next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson. Peace be with you.